So thank you for signing up to watch this webinar. You should receive an email 2 hours after the webinar, which is your proof of attendance. Please make sure you whitelist the email, customercare@gotowebinar.com, and the GoToWebinar domain. Also check your spam filters if you don't receive the email. If you are planning to use this webinar for COVA Victim Advocate Certification or Recertification, you will need to save that email and submit it with your certification packet. Any problems with that, please call me, Kirsten, at 720-399-8281. If you are watching the archived version on YouTube, welcome, and we hope that you find it informative. But please note that archived webinars may not be used towards COVA's Victim Advocate Certification. If folks have questions at any time, please go ahead and hit the raise hand function or type me a message in the chat box, and we'll go ahead and get your questions answered that way. So Sterling, do you want us to go ahead and get started with the poll?
Yeah, please.
All right. So we've got something fun to kind of wake everybody up after lunch. Let's find out who's on the line. Oh, organizers and panelists don't vote. That's no fun.
Oh, we don't get to vote. Okay, so it looks like we've got a small group. Half of you are from nonprofit, and 25% law enforcement, 25% DA prosecution. Well, I can promise there's something for everyone. And thank you so much for everything that you do. I know that this is there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of questions for every one of your sectors. So thank you. That gives me a sense of who you are and what you might be most interested in. So, all right, do you want me to just get going?
Yeah, we'll close down that poll and start hearing what we came for.
All right. So my name is Sterling Harris. I'm the Chief Deputy Director here at COVA. I've been with COVA for 10 years, and I've been working with our Public Policy Committee. We have an all-volunteer group of our committee. It's technically a subcommittee of our Board of Directors. We have a lot of our board members are involved. I was very curious about policy, starting when I was a direct service advocate. My background, for those who have never met me before, is that I was a domestic violence and sexual assault victims advocate. I worked in community-based agencies for about 7 or 8 years before I came to COVA, and had volunteered for a number of years prior to working professionally in the field. And I just, by the time I came to COVA, I was very interested in the way that we can improve systems. That was my initial, that's always been my focus, is how can we improve systems that crime victims have to come in contact with, and make life easier for people who've experienced extreme hardship through crime victimization, and use all sorts of different public policy avenues for that. So I'm very lucky that that's now a part of my position. I had to redo this webinar 3 times. And I have renamed it. It used to be just Legislative Update and how you can create change at the Colorado Legislature. It has been renamed Strange Times, 2020 Legislative Update. So our goals for today, why are you not? Okay, so some of what we'll cover today is the current state of affairs. And let me see if I can, Kirsten, how can I get this out of the way?
Oh, right here. Yep, come to that little red.
Oh, there we go. Okay. I'm new at this whole webinar thing. So what we're going to cover today is the current state of affairs, with our focus being victims and survivors of crime, and how everything that's happening right now is impacting our work at the legislature, but more like beyond the legislature, because the Colorado Capitol is now closed. We'll talk about that more later. We are still going to provide an overview of the state legislative process. Sometimes, in order to fully talk about how things have changed, we need to maybe talk about how things should be working on in a normal year. I want you all to know a little bit about how COVA works on public policy, both normally and how we are engaging now. and then some tips for both getting and staying involved. There'll be a little bit of time at the end for what I'm calling practicum work. I want to show you around the Colorado General Assembly's website and how you can find information, and maybe just provide some suggestions on how you might, some things you might want to consider as you're trying to figure out how to get involved and stay involved. So, come on now. There we go. Now, things changed literally overnight. I think the thing that's so interesting about this time is that every single one of you on the phone, every one of us over here at COVA, all of your clients that you're working with, all of us in some ways are in the same boat, but all of us have different, considerations and circumstances. And today we get to talk about, what all these changes mean specifically for crime victims. But the General Assembly has recessed for the first time in history. And so the Colorado Supreme Court announced on Monday, which was March 16th, that it had accepted a request from the legislature to look into a constitutional question related to their typical 120-day calendar. It's in our Constitution that the legislature will meet for 120 days each year. The issue is whether that 120 days must be consecutive or whether the Assembly can take a time out without losing any working days. And so we have to, and then as of this morning, March 18th, 2020, the Colorado Capitol is closed to the public indefinitely. It was going to be closed for 2 weeks. The legislature has technically recessed until the 30th, although there's kind of backroom speculation that it might be longer than that, and it's anyone's guess what's really going to happen. It had been our understanding that the Capitol itself was closed for deep cleaning. Now it's been closed to all of us indefinitely. The people, I always call it the People's House. People's House is closed. So
stay home and watch your Netflix.
Yeah. So the constitutional question that the Supreme Court has been asked to address is that in 1988, that's a long time ago, voters approved shortening the legislative session from 140 days to 120, and the intent was that this could not be changed by legislative rule. This is obviously, we have a pandemic and a major, public health crisis, and the Supreme Court's trying to figure out, what can be done, because, we have our legislature and the governor's office, they have an obligation to make sure that our citizens are safe and healthy. So that is just one of the things that has happened. The ripple effect, again, at the legislature, and with our focus for crime victims, the ripple effect of COVID-19 thus far is that, so in March, one of the things that always happens towards the middle to end of the month, this year it was scheduled for March 20th, and it got bumped up to the 16th, is there's a revenue forecast. And that's when the state has gets an idea of how much money that we have, and then that's when the budget talks, because not all bills, but many bills have something that's called a fiscal note. There's going to be a dollar sign that's attached to it. And so there we have something called the Joint Budget Committee, and they hash out kind of their parties or their chamber's priorities, start figuring out, it's like balancing your family's checkbook. And so when the revenue forecast came out on the 16th, it is much lower than it was anticipated. A lot of, as you all know, and this might be impacting some of you as well, a lot of people are out of work. People are being laid off. That's going to impact tax revenue. It's going to really impact the amount of money that comes into our state. And so that is something that our state is going to have to grapple with. The other ripple effects that we're seeing so far as it relates to crime victims and survivors is what's going to happen with courtrooms and jails. We know that, so COVA is just trying to keep up to speed, as I'm sure all of you are as well. It's our understanding that chief judges around the state are meeting to try to figure out how to reduce public appearances in courtrooms and also reduce jail populations, because there's a concern about people catching COVID-19 through both of those in those areas. We've seen a couple proposals that have been floated around, and some of them include, like one of the proposals that we have seen from one judicial district was allowing anyone who has a jail sentence that's less than 60 days to allow them to just go free for 60 days and then ask them to come back to finish their jail sentence. There are some felonies that are excluded. I think it was class 1 through 3s, crimes of violence, strangulation offenses, felony sex offenses, but there were a lot of things that fall under the VRA that were left out. And for us, the VRA is often our touchstone of knowing that those are the crimes that often cause the biggest impact. Those are the most traumatic crimes, and those are also the crime victims, people who experience those are crime victims that have rights under our Colorado Constitution. And so that's something that we are keeping an eye on, but there's change coming. We know, and for those of you who are in nonprofits, shelter programs. I don't know if we have anybody on the phone who works in a domestic violence shelter, but we know that there's a lot of uncertainty about what are you all going to do if you have to close the shelter. I will say, for all of you who are victims advocates on the phone, please contact us about our emergency fund. Make sure that you have an application on hand. We are trying to turn those applications around very quickly, and we want that to be a resource for all of you. Please do not hesitate to call us and ask us if your clients are needing anything, have financial needs that are related to their crime. Just give me a call, give COVA a call if you have any questions. There's also public safety concerns. The two largest Metro Police departments made what I'm sure was a very difficult decision to stop responding to a lot of calls, or to triage calls in a very an unprecedented way, Denver and Aurora police departments. And there's some concerns. We've also seen, there was an article in the paper today that there was a call from the state public defender's office and the ACLU asking for a moratorium on certain arrests. And so there is that concern about, if maybe somebody is a domestic violence survivor and one of those people is sick and they live maybe in one of the larger jurisdictions, are they going to be left unsafe if law enforcement doesn't come to the house? Like, we just have a lot of questions about what is going to constitute a serious call, and just, we don't want crime victims to be forgotten about in the shuffle of all of this. And then, of course, we have legislative upheaval. We are not sure what's going to happen, if I am being perfectly honest. I'm looking at my notes here. I'm a little clunky on this presentation. Like I said, this morning I was updating it for the third time, and I decided that finesse was less important than brutal honesty about what I do know, and what I don't know. So with the legislative upheaval, I'll talk about that a little bit more once we talk about the actual process. But there are this General Assembly recess and all the ways that folks are trying to figure out how to make sure people are safe, and also that the budget, or that the business that our state is taken care of. This is unprecedented, and there's a lot of folks working really hard to figure this out. So I want you all to remember that COVA is here for you. For the time being, we're all still in the office. Even if that does change, we will continue to work remotely, and we know that many of you are on the front lines, and you are hearing what crime victims need. If there are things happening in your communities, please contact me, contact Nancy Lewis, contact Kirsten or Amy if they're folks that you know. We want to know what's happening in your communities, and we will support you and the victims that you serve in the best way that we can. We are all in this together. I am not going to be as we get back to our regularly scheduled programming, we are not going to talk a lot about the specific bills that we have been following, which is normally what we do in these types of presentations. Because honestly, some of all that might be a moot point, but we'll talk about that in a few slides. So before we talk about all the ways that things are not normal, we're going to talk about what is normal. So we're going to have a little mini civics lesson and talk about how a bill becomes a law in Colorado. I'm dating myself, but if any of you know what Schoolhouse Rock is, and if you don't, YouTube. It's lots of fun. There's a little music video about how a bill becomes a law. So it's a pretty straightforward process where a lot of times the birth of a bill starts over the summer and in the summer months, where oftentimes constituents or different stakeholder groups will come to a legislator and say, hey, we've seen this problem, or hey, we have this, this thing that we think would be really helpful to our communities. Legislators weigh all that out, and oftentimes they'll say, okay, well let's maybe let's see if we can run a bill to make this a legislative change. So oftentimes, when you see bills in the legislature, there's usually, even though it might have elected officials' names, often many elected officials' names on it, there's usually a lot of other stakeholders that are behind the scenes and assisting with that, and assisting as kind of like subject matter experts. So once the idea has been fleshed out and a legislator has decided to reserve a bill title for that, each legislator only gets 5 bill titles. There are some special exceptions to that, but we won't go into that for this time. Then that's passed on to what's called a bill drafter, who kind of creates the legalese of the draft legislation. It is introduced in either the Senate or the House, so it'll be given a number like House Bill 20-1107, which is one that COVA had been working on, or Senate Bill 20-001 or something like that. It's introduced in the Senate or the House, and then it is introduced on first reading. And so that is when it's read, the bill title and the text is read in front of that entire body, and then it's assigned to a committee that usually has subject matter expertise. Well, I'll show you when we get to the part where we're touring the General Assembly's website. I'll tell you a little bit, or I'll show you kind of the different committees that are there. There are quite a few of them. The ones that COVA often spends the most time in is the Senate and House Judiciary Committees. That's where most of the criminal justice bills end up going. Sometimes bills are assigned to a few different committees, like there might be a Judiciary Committee, and then it might be referred to Finance or Appropriations if the bill will cost money. So let's say that it gets out of that committee, everyone loves it and it's voted out. Then it goes to what we call the floor, so the entire body, for a second reading. And that'll be when the entire Senate or House, wherever it is, votes on it. If it passes out, then it has a third reading, and oftentimes there's amendments made during that process, where maybe somebody will say, I'll vote for this, but only if it this little bit is tweaked, or sometimes significantly changed. And then if it passes out of third reading, then the bill has to go to the other side. So if the bill starts in the Senate and it makes it through that whole process, then it has to go to the House. And it has to go through that whole other process again. It's meant to be a system of checks and balances it's supposed to be a process that takes time to make sure that really only the thoughtful, vetted pieces of legislation actually become law. If sometimes it happens where there's 2 different drafts that end up, the version in the Senate looks different than the version that passes out of the House. And when that happens, but they both pass. When that happens, there's something called a conference committee, where there's going to be members of, usually I believe that they're kind of hand chosen by whoever the majority leaders are. They're chosen to come together and to kind of hash out their differences and come up with one final bill. And then it goes to the governor for either their signature, a veto, or I believe the governor also has the right to just let the clock run out. Governor has to sign by a certain date. So it's a pretty straightforward process. This is what it looks like in actuality. And this is, I love this image because it has a lot of information. It has pictures, which who doesn't love that? But also it's kind of sloppy looking and it looks really confusing. But if you actually can take the time to read all the text and really follow it, it's very clear. And I feel like that's a good representation of how a bill becomes law in Colorado. It is straightforward if you take the time to know the process. even though it is kind of a sloppy process, and sometimes they can get a little muddled. So as I was saying, this is how the process normally works. But unfortunately, these are not normal times. COVA had the ability to be on a call with some, kind of law enforcement, district attorneys, and other, victim advocate groups, as well as some the governor's office staff, to talk a little bit about, just some of the things that are happening, and some of the ideas that are being bandied about are, I think there's 610 bills that are still pending. It's entirely possible that those that are not mission critical, which, if we're being honest, many of them are, they're good changes and things that we need to do in order to move forward as a state, or maybe not, depending on, what your perspective is. But not all of them may be what would be called mission critical. So there's a chance that not all bills, except for the mission critical ones, will not they might not continue. It is and again, all of this is like so TBD, but this is just a conversation that has happened this morning, that possibly even like an omnibus bill or a long bill that basically includes, a budget, like the big family budget of this is what we have money for this year. That could be drafted and would include what our state needs to function. It's likely that there would be priorities of the governor's office and also the Democratic Party, because we have the House, the Senate, and the governor's office all controlled by one party, which means that things are bound to shift. There could be some priorities in there, but there are a lot of unknowns right now. It is not entirely certain if the legislature will reconvene after March 30th. And there's just a lot of questions about what can get done, again, keeping public health at the forefront. So one of the things, as I'm kind of talking about all this, I want to just give a bit of a contextual backdrop. I don't know if we have any Scandal fans on the phone, and if you've seen this presentation before, you've seen this this before. So it's Olivia Pope there, and she wears the white hat, and I always think everybody down at the Capitol and everyone who does policy work thinks they are wearing the white hat. When we are doing policy work, we all think that we're the good guy, and that can make for really hard discussions because it really comes down to our fundamental values. I always like to give criminal justice reform as an example. Criminal justice reform is a big priority in the state right now, as it should be, and yet there are some. We need to make sure that public safety and crime victims are also being considered in all of this. So oftentimes at the Capitol, we'll hear talk about kind of the quote victims of society argument, that people commit crimes, that they very truly did experience harm maybe earlier in life, didn't get the resources or assistance that they need, and then kind of came up in a way where they have ended up is really influenced by what they experienced when they were younger. That is something, the people who are bringing that argument to the table, they're not wrong in some ways, and yet, we're not wrong either, like as COVA, when we come forward and we say, the vast majority of survivors and victims never go on to harm other people, and that actions require accountability. And so it's really easy to get into the weeds with this stuff, because none of these are, black and white issues. They're not binary issues. A lot of you who are, direct service providers, you can probably think off the top of your head of a handful of victims that you're serving who may even be defendants in other cases. I mean, these are complex. And yet, in the kind of the normal legislative process, and even in this abnormal time we're in, complex issues become oversimplified due to the hurried nature of the process. So that little icon of, find X, here it is. The thing, when COVA gets a little in the weeds, the question that we always come back to, and please know that every policy decision that COVA makes is based on the decision or the answer to the question of how is this helpful or hurtful to victims of crime. That is always the lens that we view every public policy decision through. And so hopefully that'll be helpful as we talk about some of this stuff. I also always like to remind people that we won't all agree, and that's okay, as long as we remember to be respectful. In my experience of getting the privilege of being able to help COVA with the public policy work is that some of the best bills that I've seen have been when everyone is a little satisfied and also a little unsatisfied. Compromise isn't a bad thing when we're trying to find policy solutions that work for everyone, and you can't die on every hill. So you might not always agree with all of COVA's policies, all of COVA's positions. I'm okay with that. Obviously, webinar situation, we can't exactly have, vigorous, lively debate. But outside of this, I'm always willing to talk with folks on the phone and have, conversation and entertain other perspectives, as long as, you're also willing to hear our perspectives, and we can always, even if we disagree, we can respectfully disagree. So COVA, public policy, and you. Even in the best of times, we have to pick our battles. When the process is moving normally, it moves very, very fast. We don't have any control over when bills come up, when bills get moved, and that can be frustrating, especially for, there's a lot of survivors that want to start getting involved once they've reached usually a point in their healing, and sometimes not. Sometimes people jump right in, and it can be a little re-traumatizing when they are trying to be good, citizens and trying to be involved, and yet it's not easy. I mean, it's not super easy to be engaged. But so we have to, that's why we're always here for you. But we also have to pick our battles, because we don't. I'm the closest thing that we have to a public policy director, and I have about 4 or 5 other roles that I serve here. We do have a paid lobbying team, Landon Gates and Brock Herzberg. They are amazing. We couldn't do what we do without them. They are the ones who guide us through the process, and sometimes when we get passionate, as advocates do, they are the ones who remind us, you're passionate in the way that you want to approach it. You might want to think about this before you burn a bridge that you're going to need at another time. And so they help us to remember to slow down, help guide us on the process, and sometimes they're very good sounding boards to keep us from knee-jerking, I guess would be the best way to put it. As I mentioned before, all 3 branches, or 3 bodies, would be a better word. The House, the Senate, and the governor's office are currently controlled by one party, and so things are bound to shift. That's another thing that that's another area that we have to pick our battles in. And also with this, what's happened in the past few weeks, we are in uncharted territory. We are going to have to pick our battles as we move forward, because this is, as I said, every single person in our world is impacted right now. We have a group, as I mentioned, we have a public policy committee that meets year-round. It includes, what we do is ongoing work with legislators. We participate and monitor groups like the Sex Offender Management Board, Colorado Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice, and different interim committees. We coordinate with other policy-oriented groups as needed, such as the Colorado Victims for Justice, which is a really great grassroots group of victims and survivors who are focused on making the criminal justice system better for everyone. The Colorado District Attorney's Council, the Colorado Coalition Against Sexual Assault and Violence Free Colorado. It takes time and effort, but I have to tell you that we need your voice, and especially now, because things are so chaotic. So there's that part. I am hoping that most of you are already signed up for COVA's email blasts, and I'm hoping that you are also signed up for emails from Violence Free Colorado, COVA, and also I believe that CDAC, the District Attorney's Council, also has a mailing list now. And so we oftentimes, one of the ways that we can communicate when all hands we need all hands on deck is through those email blasts. And oftentimes, I know for COVA, I always, title them Action Alert. And those really are the last ditch effort when we really do need all hands on deck, because all other avenues have been exhausted. Most of the work that we do is behind the scenes. One of the things you never want to have happen is to show up for a bill hearing and you've never conveyed your concerns, you've never conveyed what it is that you want to be changed, because by the time things happen in a committee, usually most decisions have been made. I mean, most legislators will walk into a committee hearing, I'm guessing, largely having made up their mind. There might be one or two people that are a swing vote, or they could go either way. But again, most of that work happens in the background. And by the time we send out something that's titled Action Alert, we really do need you. So are there any questions yet?
Give folks a moment to type. If somebody's got something long enough that typing it doesn't seem feasible, send me a chat and I'll unmute you. If we unmute everyone, sometimes we get feedback. So that's why everyone, if you're listening by phone or your computer audio, you'll be muted for talking at the moment. Also, that way we don't hear you crunching your carrots or your popcorn or all the fun snacks that we have. All right, so far so good.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I do, even though a lot of this may be a moot point, I'm still going to share a little bit of what COVA's been following at the legislature, both the good, the bad, and the ugly. And sometimes those little gremlins sitting there eating popcorn, sitting back and just watching the theater. I mean, sometimes that is a little bit what it feels like at the Capitol. I mean, sometimes things happen and you just have to kind of sit there and just let it wash over you, and then go home at the end of the day saying, wow, well, that happened. So a bill that we had put a lot of effort into opposing is Senate Bill 76. And this bill is concerning parole eligibility of an offender who committed an offense between 18 and 25 years of age. It's sponsored by Senator Pete Lee out of El Paso and Representative Serena Gonzalez Gutierrez out of Denver. The earlier incarnation of this bill, there had been an interim committee on prison population. And there had been a proposal that sometimes there are these interim committees, and they're often created through legislation the prior year that will say this committee will be formed, and these are the areas that it will look at, and these are the specific types of people who will be sitting on this committee, and they are allowed to bring forward 5 bills. So this was one of those interim task forces. And one of the bills that was proposed would have created an entirely separate class of offender who, somebody who had committed if they had committed their crime between the ages of 18 and 25, they would basically have their own sentencing structure, all of this. It did not make it out of committee. And so this bill, which deals with parole eligibility, is kind of a different approach at that same idea. So essentially, what this one would do is make presumptive parole for anyone who had committed an offense between the ages of 18 and 25. The only thing that would be excluded is life without parole, people who received life without parole, and we had heard that sex offenses were going to be removed from that. This was a really triggering bill for, I can't tell you how many calls I received from mothers of homicide victims who, finding out that the person that, killed oftentimes their child, would be out after only serving, 50% of their sentence. And for those of you who are familiar with Colorado's sentencing structures, we have very, very complicated sentencing rules already. There's, you get good time, you get earned time. There's all of this stuff you can apply to ComCore, before you are eligible to even to apply for parole. And it's just this whole big thing. And so, and also too, there's just the pragmatic piece of it that we are afforded a lot of different rights and responsibilities between the ages of 18 and 25. We can vote. We can be, go into the military. We can purchase a firearm and carry concealed. We can sign a lease. We can drink, buy marijuana. We can do a whole bunch of stuff. And so we did not see a lot of corresponding legislation that would change requirements for all of those things, because the justification for this bill is that there are studies that indicate that our brains might not be fully developed until we are 25. There's also studies that indicate our brains never fully, are always changing. But for us, it doesn't make sense that we would have still have the same kind of set of rules and the rights and responsibilities in all these other areas, but then the one time we're going to make an exception is if somebody has caused immense harm. So, for example, in this slide, there was a list of 55 inmates in the Department of Corrections, and it's a list of inmates that was provided by the Department of Corrections of people that would be eligible if this bill became law. I took out the names and the judicial districts and the inmate numbers, but I wanted to show you all a list of the types of crimes, second-degree murder, child abuse resulting in death, first-degree assault. The sexual assaults we hear would be taken out, aggravated robbery. These are pretty serious crimes. And we also had significant concerns that this would undermine something that's called Lynn's Law. Some of you may know a man named Joe Canada and his wife Kay Canada. They run a nonprofit called Voices of Victims. And they had a dry cleaning company, and their daughter, Lynn, was stabbed to death in front of her 2-year-old son, Matthew, by her boyfriend, and she was pregnant. And they ended up selling their business and founding a nonprofit where they provide post-sentencing support to victims of crime. They had been through this. Joe and Kay worked for 9 years to get a law passed in Lynn's name that basically said that people who have committed certain crimes, high-level crimes, of which some of these on this right-hand list are also there, that people who had committed these crimes would serve 75% of their sentence before they were eligible for parole. This would just gut that law for this age group. So we don't like this bill. And for us, this is we're hoping that this one will go away, particularly if the legislature has to start making hard decisions about, what continues and what's mission critical. We do not think that this is mission critical. And so we are hoping that this one goes away. Now, some bills that we do actually hope will be included in whatever happens from here. COVA spends a lot of time monitoring what is happening around sex offenders. Colorado has the way that Colorado manages and treats sex offenders in our state, convicted sex offenders. Like national statistics indicate that only 3% of sex offenders ever spend a day in jail. And one of the things that we believe is that having strong systems of accountability will encourage survivors to come forward, because more and more survivors are coming forward after whole, hashtag Me Too, after some of the high profile cases that have happened. And we feel like it shows a strong message of support if we are continuing to have strong systems of accountability in place that also allow for treatment and to give offenders the ability to change. And that is really a big part of what the Sex Offender Management Board does. It was statutorily created in 1992 to protect public safety by developing and implementing standards for the evaluation, treatment, and behavioral monitoring of adult sex offenders and juveniles who've committed sex offenses. And we believe that SOMB is essential to safeguarding Colorado communities, and it's also set to sunset or expire this year. This board is a lightning rod. It causes controversy every time it comes up comes up for sunset, sometimes even when it doesn't come up for sunset. And it is all boards and commissions have a sunset review, or a date that, basically the legislature can look at, okay, has this board finished its work? Is it still relevant? And if it is no longer relevant, it can go away. That going away process takes about a year. So there are other boards that are set to sunset, and those have all been assigned legislative sponsors, and the legislation to continue them has been introduced. SOMB is the only one that has not been assigned a sponsor and has not been introduced. And there are some legislators that would very much like to see this board go away. So one of the things that we've heard about is that possibly if there is maybe like a big, like an omnibus bill of trying to figure out, just what does the state need to, what's mission critical, that maybe a 1-year sunset or like a 1-year reauthorization for the Sex Offender Management Board and also all other boards and commissions that are set to sunset, reauthorizing all of those, boards and commissions for 1 year, and then we can try to, we can have the more normal, thoughtful process once we're not in the middle of a pandemic crisis. Another bill that also has to deal with sex offenders that we are hoping will move forward because it's almost all the way through the process anyway, is sex offender community corrections requirements. Right now we have a loophole that allows sex offenders who have not received offense-specific treatment, which is required in Colorado. It allows them to apply to community corrections facilities, and it's rare that they get accepted, but it can happen, and it does sometimes happen, which basically means sex offenders that haven't had that treatment, who've just been kind of burning their number in jail, they're allowed to be in the community without having that treatment that's going to help them to be successful and to not reoffend. This is a bill that just tightens that up. It just says that if you want to apply to ComCore, if a sex offender wants to apply to ComCore, they have to have progressed in treatment with the exact same standards that somebody who's applying for parole would have to meet. So we feel like that's a pretty common sense one. It has not been super controversial. We're hoping, it's good for public safety. We're hoping that this one gets all the way through just because it's almost there anyway. Bills that we have to say goodbye to, or efforts that we have to say goodbye to, which is a bummer, are ones that would create positive change for crime victims. Some of you are probably, those of you who are in law enforcement and district attorney's offices for sure, are familiar with something called VINE, which is Victim Information Notification Every Day. VINE is an automated system for making sure that victims have that notification when an offender is released, has escaped, is being transferred. Do you remember, Kirsten, do you remember what else VINE? That's pretty much the big
coming
right?
in and out of and out of jails.
And it's also something that anyone, offenders' family members can also sign up for VINE. It's a very good service. Unfortunately, the version of VINE that we have in Colorado is getting old, and Apris is the company that created the VINE software. They have transitioned most other states to something called enhanced VINE. It's more modern, it's more user-friendly. Right now they are supporting the two platforms, kind of old VINE, which Colorado is on, and enhanced VINE, which Colorado wants, which we want to get to. They are not going to support the older version of VINE within 2 years. And so if we don't have to figure out a way to get this funded, which we've been trying to do for 3 years now, we will lose VINE entirely. And I had an advocate I spoke with a few weeks ago had asked, well, what is this? Is there a system in place that could take the place of VINE? And the answer is no, except for your individual agencies, which would probably have to go back to making those manual notifications. No one really wants to do that. So we're working, we think we might have some other clever ways to get enhanced VINE funded. We had been asking for money from the legislature. We needed about $555,000. We've been kind of getting money committed from other areas, and the whole dollar amount we need is around over $800,000, but we had gotten that down and we were feeling really good about ourselves, and then all this happened and there's no way anybody's going to show us the money. So we will have to say goodbye to this. Our current solution to this problem, we're hoping that we can still get that done through other avenues. One that is breaking my heart to have to say goodbye to for this year is House Bill 1107, which was concerning a victim towing and impound fee grant program. This was sponsored by Representative Tom Sullivan from Aurora and Senator Bob Garden from El Paso. Some of you, especially if you work in DA's offices and in law enforcement, possibly have had to deal with me yammering on about crime victims being assessed towing and impound fees as a result of their crime victimization, and that goes from theft all the way up through sexual assault, homicide. Victims sometimes get charged with towing and impound fees, and most people that you talk to say that's not fair, but the thing that has been challenging is, one, collecting data, and two, trying to figure out who would pay for that. This was our first time where we got a bill moved forward of trying to figure out how we would do that. It's a bill to get $100,000 from the general fund. 90,000 of it would go towards basically helping crime victims. 10% would go towards like administration, and there would be data collection along the way to try to figure out the scope of the problem and then come up with longer term solutions. This is probably one that this is, as much as I care about this, if I'm looking at the bigger picture and being altruistic, this is probably not mission critical. So this is likely one that we're just going to have to say goodbye to for this year. Although who knows? We don't know what's going to happen. Maybe I'll be pleasantly surprised. But I'm gearing myself that we'll have to say goodbye to this one, which this was a family. This was an article that was in the Denver Post, about a Colorado family being blindsided by a $4,800 towing bill after a driver killed their son. So there's always next year, right? So staying involved. I want you all to remember that democracy is not simply a license to indulge individual whims and proclivities. It's also holding oneself accountable to some reasonable degree for the conditions of peace and chaos that impact the lives of those who inhabit one's beloved extended community. I feel like this quote is really appropriate for right now. We're all being asked to stay home, or to stay home as much as possible, and just in the name of social responsibility and to take care of one another. And part of the way that we take, honestly, public policy and the laws that we create is a reflection of our values when it comes to taking care of each other. And so this is where we're going to have a little practical application time. So, am I still good, Kirsten?
Yep.
Okay. So many people don't know who their legislator is, and that is not a statement to inspire shame. This isn't like, if you may be saying, I write them all the time, I got them on speed dial, and that's awesome. If you don't, this is your time where you are going to find out exactly how to find your person. So you can literally Google Colorado, find my legislator, and it's even ledge.colorado.gov/find-my-legislator.
Sometimes things are that easy, right?
Sometimes things literally. Well, and the General Assembly, they redid their website a couple of years ago, and it did not used to be this user-friendly, and it is awesome now. So we have this little map here, and we'll just use COVA's address. Okay, so there we go. So we log in COVA's address, and looky here. We have Representative Steve Woodrow. He does not have a picture. And then we have Senator Robert Rodriguez. So Robert Rodriguez, one of the things, we'll click on him so what you can do, especially if you're having to work from home or, you're kind of having to limit the time you're able to spend with your clients, even if you are in the office, you can look up your electeds and get to know them a little bit. So we click on Senator Robert Rodriguez. Here's all of his contact information. And I can also see here are the different committees that he sits on. I already knew this, but he sits on Judiciary Committee. He has a lot of influence on a lot of the bills that COVA follows. He also has a lot of influence on appropriations. Appropriations is who gets to decide where it's like, is there going to be money appropriated to this stuff? He has a lot of influence. Those are pretty big committees for what COVA is concerned about. So here's, if you scroll down even further, here's some of the bills that he's sponsoring. You can learn a little bit about, who your person is and the things that they're interested in, and, give them a call. I will say that the thing that I would encourage all of you to do right now is, because there are so many things up in the air and you all are seeing things with the people that you serve. I mean, in just, those of you who work in DA's offices, what is that going to look like if there's speedy, and I'm not an attorney, so I don't totally get this, but there's speedy trial questions. Our understanding is all jury trials have been pushed out till April. How is this going to create the backlog and the victims that you have responsibilities to notify them? For those of you in law enforcement, if folks start getting let out of jail, or people are, you have, sometimes even though a lot of victims will call maybe like, 911, and that's how they get tied in with the criminal justice system. I also know that a lot of crime victims, they call you because they look at the victim assistance unit number and they'll call you maybe before considering making a report. How is that going to work for you all if victims are unsure if somebody's even going to show up, if they have been a victim of a crime and they're not, there's limitations on what officers can respond to right now. For those of you in nonprofits, you have different considerations. I know that some of our partners in nonprofits are having to limit their hours. You're not able to meet with clients. You're having to do all your work remotely. Shelters are really have a lot of concerns. All of your legislators, they aren't at the Capitol right now. They're back in your communities and they care about your communities. And so now is the time to give them a call, send them an email about what it is that you're seeing. And you don't have to be fancy. You don't have to be respectful, but you don't have to, you can just tell them what it is that you're seeing and you can ask for help. They want to know what's happening. They might not have answers, but it'll at least put the people you care about in the back of their mind as things are shaping up.
So they're still working too. That was my question they're kind of
they're in, I don't know what
they're like us.
they're kind of like a lot of us. I mean, I'm sure they're still doing stuff, but they can't be at the Capitol. They can't vote on bills. They can't, but they're most likely home and in front of their computer.
It's a really good time to email, actually.
It's a good time to email and maybe see if, and some of them even put, like, if you're on their mailing list, like my senator is Jeff Bridges. He has he has an auto reply that it's pretty canned, but he does have his personal cell number in there. So some of them you can even give a call and have a nice little conversation about what survivors are experiencing. So again, like once things are back in order, committees, the committee tabs are also another really good thing to get familiar with. I mentioned, there's the House and then there's the Senate. Here are all the different committees that bills can be assigned to. I will say if you ever see a bill that's been assigned to state veterans and military affairs in either the House or the Senate, that's what's called the Kill Committee. That's where bills are sent to go away. So sometimes you'll see bills that are just so extreme, or sometimes bills that are actually quite good, but they don't have support of, there's a whole other, there's politics involved. They go there, and that's usually mean we're there. Sometimes those bills can get out of the Kill Committee, but that's usually where they go to die. And again, judiciary. So let's look at House judiciary, for example. These are often the people that again, when things are back in working order, and if there's criminal justice bills that you're looking at and they happen to be in House judiciary, oftentimes, in addition to talking with your own representatives, these are the people that you really want to focus your energy on. They're kind of that first hurdle. And so it's good to know that because it can help you be strategic in your advocacy work, because it can feel overwhelming. However, I am going to not get into that as much because we don't know if those committees are even going to be meeting again this year. So I want you all to, we're almost towards the end. I want to end with a few reminders that you have both the right and the responsibility to be civically engaged. Make sure that you are signed up for emails from COVA, Violence Free Colorado, and COVA. Maybe look up the District Attorney Council's website. I know that their mailing list is pretty new, and I don't know if maybe they have a little link on their website that you can sign up. And please remember that when action alerts go out, they do mean business. For those of you who work in the nonprofit sector, this was a particular passion of mine, just because I've always worked in nonprofits. I always joke that I wouldn't do too well in government agencies. Nancy Lewis, our boss here, likes to tell me, she's like, I think you have a little problem with authority. Just kidding. I respect authority, but I might ask a lot of questions along the way. Nonprofits do have the right to conduct policy work. There's a myth out there that when you're a nonprofit, you can't do any public policy work. Now, you have to be careful. Like, for example, a lot of us have VOCA dollars. A lot of us are funded by VOCA dollars. You cannot use federal dollars to advocate for or against certain legislation. However, you are not limited on providing education. So for example, you might be able to educate about, like, maybe there's a bill that has to deal with, let me pick one. House Bill 1088 has to deal with U visas. And maybe, your agency receives some VOCA funding, but you also know your agency works with a lot of immigrant survivors of crime, people who are, maybe a lot of people who are undocumented and might be eligible for U visas. You are not prohibited from sharing with legislators or sharing with people in your community how this bill might impact. That here's just what our people are seeing, our community is seeing. Hopefully that helps a little bit. Now, the one thing that providing education on issues that affect your mission, you absolutely have the right to do that. There's something called the no substantial part test and the 501H election. As long as there is no substantial part of your agency's work that is spent doing public policy, and that's usually interpreted as being between 3 to 5% of your agency's work being spent, doing advocacy, that is acceptable. For agencies that want to be extra above the board, especially agencies like COVA that do, we proudly claim and do public policy work, we've taken something called the 501H election, where it's basically like a formula that says how much money you can spend every year on doing advocacy, on legislative advocacy, voting or taking positions for and against bills and things like that. We don't have a ton of time to get into this, but I'm happy to answer questions offline. Or another fantastic resource on this issue is Boulder Advocacy. This is like their whole wheelhouse. They even have like a helpline. So if you have a question, you can call, ask your question, and they'll follow back up with you. It's awesome. The one thing that you cannot do as a nonprofit is support or oppose candidates. That's the one thing that no nonprofit can do. Now, those of you who work in systems, you have additional challenges. You do have the right, though, to get clear guidelines from your place of employment about how you can use your voice. I mean, if you work for a government agency, but you are only there for you're only paid to be do that work 40 hours a week, you should not be prohibited from following up with your elected officials or, on legislation you care about. You just don't be going out there saying, I'm a victim advocate with such and such police department, or, I'm, unless you have the blessing of your agency, of course, but you should, if you remove your affiliation with your job and that government agency, you should not be stifled from advocating for the things that you care about. That's a pretty important right that we have as citizens. So it's good to talk with your supervisors, get clear guidelines, and if those don't exist, they might need, ask for, you can always ask for guidance. And again, I'm happy to talk with folks offline if you experience challenges. And educate yourself and share with the survivors you advocate for how they can create change. I've already mentioned Colorado Victims for Justice. They're a great grassroots group. I'm a member of it myself. They meet here at COVA, and I'm always happy to get folks in touch with our volunteer chairman, Ray Harlan. And a lot of survivors, they do reach a point where they say, I want to be involved with something bigger than myself. And that can be incredibly healing and incredibly empowering. So there's that. Now, one final call for questions. While maybe you're typing or thinking or getting ready to get up and go about your day, we will probably be doing this again. No, we will be doing this again once we have a better sense of what's happening. Again, my number and my email, I'm going to be as available as I possibly can be, and I want to hear from you all as we're trying to figure these wild times out. Any questions?
No, you covered all the four corners.
Okie dokie.
And let me mention, I know we're kind of in Maslow's hierarchy at the moment, so probably folks aren't thinking about trainings or webinars that they want to see 3 months from now. But, that's what our job and my job specifically is, to provide you with trainings that are helpful and useful to you. And we decide what we're putting forward, in a variety of ways. But if there is a webinar, especially for those of you not in the metro area that you think would be helpful, please let me know. If I don't provide it, I can very often find someone who does. So yeah, don't forget about that while you're working from home and you need a break. Kind of think about, what other information might be helpful to you or your agency, because you definitely won't be the only one.
And just if nobody has told you today, thank you for everything that you do in your communities. And we're all going to get through this, and just thank you for everything that you do, and thank you for being here today.
Ditto that. Thanks so much, Sterling. Everybody have a great afternoon.